Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're talking about DC's. I'm losing the title. Dark Knight's Death Metal Trinity Crisis #1. So you can understand why I stumbled on that. It's getting real complicated with this death metal book and its tie-in names, but on the whole, this is a pretty cool tie-in. It's different from the ones we reviewed so far for death metal, though I definitely like a lot of aspects of the non-Legends of the Dark Knight. The guidebook was good. The Legends book was okay. This book is a single story and really ties into the ongoing story of death metal as opposed to the previous tie-ins, which give you more of a background and a sense of the geography of this metal verse. On the whole, Trinity Crisis is kind of a must read if you're an ongoing fan of death metal, or at least I feel as much based on how much important ground is covered in this particular book, basically linking what I assume is going to be the events of issue #3 of Death Metal to issue #4. It's also got a really cool idea going on. One you can almost kind of glean from the cover, was shown there and is easily accessible, but basically featuring Superboy Prime, the Anti-Monitor, and Darkseid, or at least some version of them, well, from their various crisis events. And we'll just leave it at that for now. So yeah, it's a pretty cool story. It's written by Scott Snyder. Francis Manipool does the artwork, and they do a great job. We've seen that team before in stuff like No Justice. Ian Herring does the coloring, and Tom Napolitano does the lettering. I really like this book overall, and would probably recommend it. Thanks for dropping in, Adrian. Sorry you can't join us for however long, but thanks for coming. And let's get into this book a little bit in terms of spoilers, I guess. So we open on the Crisis of Infinite Earths, the Infinite Crisis, and the Final Crisis. Whole big page spreads of, oh, Josie Rags, thanks for joining. But yeah, we got a full page of each event, and again, this is where it's like, we really get a chance for Francis Manipool to show off some cool artwork here that spans the DC universe in terms of history. So, strong opening, followed up by us flashing right to the end of Death Metal #3. And the heroes are all agreeing to work together. In my review for that issue, I talked about how I didn't love how it turns out all of these superheroes are perfectly fine and just hanging out in this vault the whole time that all the events of death metal had been playing out up until now. And unlike Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman, Harley Quinn, and Swamp Thing, oh, and I guess Jonah Hex, like, we don't get a death metal version of these characters. This book reduces that opinion, or like it tones me down a little bit on that, because I kind of see why they did that, and I get that we're getting a lot more content beyond what was initially shown here. And if you look at the schedule of death metal stuff coming out, there's a lot of tie-ins on our way. So I kind of better understand that moment from Death Metal #3. This book really helps with that, and I'm less against it at this point. I'll get into why as we kind of go along. Anyways, they go over the plan again, which is good because I think it's a little confusing, but they make it very clear in this book, and that's why I said it's kind of a must-read for death metal, at least in my opinion. So they talk about the crisis energy and how Perpetua's using it to basically fuel this whole tie-in event, we'll say, or crossover event, whatever you want to call it. The Batman Who Laughs created 3 worlds where there's major crises going on, allowing them to do all of this. And a huge part of the hero's plan basically hinges on them executing it. Michelle Jimenez says the death metal series will end on next year. That's right. It's bigger and larger in scope than I even thought, even after they said they were increasing it in scope and size from their initial plans. And you can kind of see how that happened now, where the initial start of this little series was relatively contained in just its core series and a couple of tie-ins, and that's ramping up over time as we see, which probably reflects their production of it as a whole. So, then they kind of turned to Jaro because, as they said at the end of Death Metal number 3, he's an essential part of them doing this plan, and it turns out it's because of his telepathy. They made a special jar from him, well, Mr. Miracle did, that amplifies his psychic abilities and should allow them to infiltrate Castle Bat undetected. So, that's the plan. It's just all nicely laid out there, and not in a boring way either. It was entertaining. We got some fun dialogue from characters like Jaro that I always find entertaining. If you've read about this character from Snyder's run on Justice League, it's pretty well put together on the whole, if you ask me. He's a fun little character and yet another Robin, but a totally different one that I particularly enjoy. So, the Justice League kind of divides up into little teams, each to do various parts of infiltrating Castle Bat. And basically the Trinity, Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman, are going to go to these 3 different crisis worlds and get the energy they need. So, they head out. Swamp Thing taps into what's left of the green, which makes him very vulnerable to all green being wiped out on Earth, basically. But it's a really cool scene. It shows him drawing from like the scraps of life that are remaining on Metalverse. Again, Manipul's just nailing it in this book, and we get this cool shot, or a cool page, I should say, separated by vines, showing different aspects of the Earth as the Swamp Thing gradually does this and forms a cave, allowing them to sneak into Castle Bat. It also gets into why the land around Wayne Manor was originally undeveloped, which is an interesting point, and Batman talks about the bedrock of the land around his manor. It kind of makes sense. It's a neat little detail. So, meanwhile, they are updating what's going on in the larger event, and the Flashes are fleeing the darkest night, that what the Batman Who Laughs has become. And they are attacked by a bunch of different Batmen. That's part of what really has sold me on this, and the Justice League being relatively normal, is we get so many alternate Batman. And I forgot to mention earlier, there's a great shot of a Red Lantern Batman, the Grim Knight, a Bat Mazo, War Bat, the more Joker Dragons, Black Monday, a Batman version of Solomon Grundy, Ark, a Batman version of Scarecrow, Chiropter, a Batman version of Chemo, the Pearl, we'll get into her, and Cull, which looks like an evil version of Batwoman. There's a lot of stuff going on in chat. Mr. DC Comics, thanks for joining us. He's saying this is a 4-year story, all told to reboot everything, hopefully. That's certainly one way of looking at it. What he's saying there is that this is something that Snyder's been slowly kind of building towards ever since, like, before No Justice, even. And this is kind of the payoff of it. And when we're talking about all these crazy alternate Batman, like, I'm starting to be won over. The Justice League being relatively normal is fine against the legion of all this other crazy alternate versions of Batman. And yeah, it's a lot, but that's the whole point. It's kind of almost tongue-in-cheek, and it's having fun along the way. I've heard someone compare this to fan fiction, but I've also heard, like, in a lot of ways, all of these comics beyond their original runs are fan fiction, and that's okay. Mr. DC Comics is saying Doomsday Clock was the perfect reboot story compared to Dark Knight's Metal. Well, see, that's where it gets subjective, because I would disagree. I really didn't get much out of Doomsday Clock and really didn't feel like it had any traction or significance. But maybe that's a conversation for like another day or something. Adrian saying, I've not listened to the Marilyn Manson song associated with this yet. Oh, yes, I saw that. I like when they do stuff such as that. It reminds me of when they did, like, a song for Spider-Gwen in her early days. Over on Marvel's end, obviously, but it's fun. Why not? And if people, like musicians, get inspired by this or get paid to do stuff like this, that's great. Um, okay. Well, sorry, I'm just. Ninja Genko says, "Where's Matches Malone?" I mean, he's wielding a black ring right now, technically, right? um, Josie's saying, "It really don't matter how Batman can use a Black Lantern ring. They need everything they can get." It's kind of cool stuff like that, where that would be a huge deal in another story, and it really just barely keeps Batman in queue with everything. I didn't really talk much about it last issue, but it's also pretty cool how Superman's empowered by the anti-life equation, and Wonder Woman's all geared out. Oh, they also have Alfred boxes, which is a goofy little take on Mother boxes, but hey, that's the theme of Metalverse, and it's pretty great, all these little connections. Speaking of which, we get a closer look at the Pearl, who attacks Batman, and is his mother, wielding a giant robot suit. Again, just a fun little detail. Yeah, so that all keeps going. Sorry, I was just checking what's going on in chat. They kind of delve further into Castle Bat and find Barbados from the original Metal story. And they have a pretty interesting conversation because Batman's like, this is all your fault. And Barbados has a good, or not it's just an interesting point where he basically talks about how his whole existence was to devour worlds based on the fears and resentments and dark feelings of the various people of the regular universes. And he talks about how it amped up over time. And, this has been done before, but it basically reflects the darker themes that have slowly taken hold in superhero stories and that sort of thing. It's an interesting little point. It's not played up longer than a page, which I think is important because stuff like that, I think, could be overplayed. And I think what a strength of death metal is Snyder has these interesting ideas, but he's wise enough not to overindulge them, which, to be fair, this writer has done in other stories in the past. And it's part of why I keep getting encouraged by this thing. After, the last couple issues, I wasn't as sure. So, that happens, but then it gets interrupted with the arrival of the Robin King, who basically attacks Jonah Hex, Swamp Thing, and Harley Quinn, who are trying to hold off whatever's coming their way so that the Trinity can get through to these crisis worlds. And they do make it through and emerge through a portal, while the Robin King attacks these heroes. And in a great nod to Snyder's run with Swamp Thing, he throws a little bit of the rot at Swamp Thing, and it just instantly cripples the elemental. For those of you who read that run back in the New 52, Scott Snyder had some really interesting ideas with connecting the green to the red of Animal Man, and that to something called the Rot, which just embodies death and decay. So it's the perfect weapon against Swamp Thing, and a really cool little thing for Robin King to throw out, and is kind of reflective of death metal, almost encompassing every little thing that Scott Snyder has written for DC over the years, which I like, especially because he's kind of taking from the best of his stories, all of which is pretty great. Hold on, I needed a little bit of water after talking 15 minutes straight. Adrian is saying, I wonder if they will have a Batman and Superman one-off for death metal. I don't really know. There's so many of these tie-ins at this point, it's hard to keep track. There's a bunch of Justice League's books coming, and one of those stories could focus just on Batman and Superman. They could very easily have that series, the Batman Superman series, tie in to death metal at some point. It kind of already has, so it wouldn't be much of a stretch. And there's so many. I just passed an ad in this book for a different one that looked pretty cool. Multiverse's End that has some shots of a bunch of characters from Multiversity, which I thought was pretty fun. uh, Adrian is saying also a death metal Batman might be fun. That would be great. Um, yeah. Anyway, sorry, I was just checking chat there. Nothing much. I feel the need to. I don't have much to say. A lot of it's just kind of back and forth between people there. So, all that's going on. Jonah Hex basically gets shot by some sort of. It's loaded with something called the debrider that eats away at necrotic tissue and just completely decimates Jonah Hex, who's an undead construct created by Batman. And he has a nice little final moment. It's not like he even has a final speech. He just kind of says like, "Remember everything. Remember, expendable or not, everything matters," and just trails off. It's a good little moment that signifies how just quick it all is. And Swamp Thing leaves with Quinn and Jarro through a portal, while we cut to Batman, Wonder Woman, and Clark, each kind of focusing on different crises. Batman emerges on the Crisis of Infinite Earths, and there's just nothing. It's a white void. And it becomes almost instantly apparent to me, it's like, okay, these are worlds where the crises didn't work out in the hero's favor. So the Anti-Monitor, he just got his white wave of nothingness. And the universe around him just reacts to Batman being composed of matter. And pretty soon, this little child version of the Anti-Monitor emerges around a completely encased in like this fleshy substance Batman. So, they're all just starting out in trouble, and presumably this is, because, we're at the end of the book, where Death Metal number 4 is going to pick up on. And that's what I'm saying, like, oh yeah, big moves happen in this book, and it seems like Death Metal's going in a pretty interesting direction. Then we go to the final crisis. Superman lands on a very dark-looking Earth. He gets punched down by a apocalyptian Superman surrounded by all these other versions of Justice League characters wearing Darkseid's symbol. Clearly, he's taken over here, and we see this horned and powerful, very Grant Morrison-y Darkseid saying to Superman, "Oh, this is exactly where you should be." And then we go to the Infinite Crisis, and Wonder Woman gets knocked into the Daily Planet and looks around and says she doesn't remember this happening. And we realize a lot of this narration that's been going on has been of Superboy Prime saying you just you didn't appreciate the gravity of the word crisis. These are words, these are worlds that we have shaped. We being these three evil characters, the Anti-Monitor, Darkseid, and Superboy Prime. And these are their worlds. And he's standing over Wonder Woman, presumably fully empowered and decked out in his armor. So it's quite the book, and I really liked it. It was a strong start to my week. Oh, I didn't really talk about it much, but I got a little busy this week and didn't have a lot of time for these streams, so we're kind of playing catch up to the books that I pulled last week, of which I got a good amount. But I've read them all, so we should be able to, over the next couple of days, move through a good number of these streams. Alright, now I've kind of let chat get away from me, so let me see where we are here. Oh, thanks for joining us, Adrian. Oh, you were around for a good chunk of that stream. Mikhail was saying the next story of Death Metal is Speed Metal. The Batman Who Laughs, Darkest Nights has an army of Lightning Knights. It's getting interesting to see them. Yes, I have that book on order, and we will review it. I couldn't remember what's coming when, but it looked pretty cool to me. It's such a fun little detail that they're using. The double meaning of metal obviously has relevance both in the original Metal book and this book in terms of being a Kickstarter to a lot of these things, but often being a fuel for various actions for superheroes, but it's also a clear reference to music and the aesthetics that are used across these books, and that's where like a song tie-in makes all the sense in the world, and speed metal just reflects that perfectly. It's fun. It feels like the kind of thing that could be its own event, which, by the way, I would totally say this could be too. Trinity Crisis seems like the kind of thing they could do, and it feels like it could carry an event. So for it to just be a part of death metal just shows how big this all is and how many ideas are being floated around here. And I really don't object to that. I just can't. It's a fun ride mixed with some fascinating artwork featuring content from stories that I liked to begin with. So who am I to object to such things? I say that just because there's some people that really don't like death metal, and I can understand why, but I'm just on board. I'm having a fun time reading these books, and can't see a reason to apologize to that. I mentioned a lot of the cool stuff that Manipool draws across this thing, but failed to mention the splash page of 3 different crises unfolding on these, like on this one page, where we see the like Anti-Monitor just tearing apart a world, Superboy Prime defeating 3 different versions of Superman, and then Darkseid doing the same to another Superman. It just looks so damn cool. Mr. DC Comics is saying, I got a feeling Wonder Woman will end up fighting Perpetua using the powers of Dr. Manhattan at the end. You know what? That kind of makes sense and sort of feels like it ties in nicely to the events that kicked off death metal specifically, and maybe that's where we're going. Maybe it will get to be Wally West. I don't know. That would be cool if he gets to save the day. Although, you know, generally events like this don't end well for versions of the Flash, and maybe what DC Comics is implying there, or Mr. DC Comics I should say, is kind of hinting at the direction of where things are going to go for that reason. But death metal isn't a traditional crisis, and if anything, it's kind of setting itself up to be some sort of anti-crisis, which creates life, is what they're getting at, and kind of seems the overall tone and direction of Snyder's plan for DC Comics that did ultimately take hold after whatever happened behind the scenes. Josie Rag saying Superboy Prime finally gets his respect. Yes, especially given that it was just a week ago we were talking about the return and awesome adventure of Superboy Prime in the main universe in the Shazam book. That was pretty fun in my opinion. And hopefully we get to see him do more crazy, violent nonsense going forward. I don't know. It could be... He can be a fun character if done right or well going forward. I'm curious to see what they have planned for this guy. So yeah, strong book overall. Definitely recommended. And I appreciate everyone joining us in chat for all of this today. This was a lot of fun. It's nice to get back on this horse a little bit. But I think we're going to move on now to the next book that I pulled, and that is Web of Venom Wraith, a book I didn't really know much about going into, but I'm quite glad I read, and seems to be very much leading up to more stuff in the world of Venom going forward, and not having much to do with Venom Beyond, which we have also been talking about, but clearly in the overall arc of story that Donny Cates has planned for this particular character. And boy, does he have so much planned for that character. Anyhow, thanks for joining us everybody, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.